Hello, everyone. We ask you that you please find a seat, and we are going to get started in a few minutes. Thank you.
That's our rector, Nikki Boychuk-Hale, who is fabulous. I think she deserves a round of applause for that announcement. Segal, Anin, Bojo, Tanashi, Kiawao. Hello and how are you? Welcome to the inaugural Chancellor Emeritus Murray Sinclair Iban Lecture, honoring the leadership and the legacy of our Chancellor Emeritus Murray Sinclair, Majina Gizek Iban. Ne Queen's University etno nungwe, ne gonosote jinungwe. Ne hodnushode daknun anishnabik, de hadis nunsa here ne on kwanja. Gimakwe gichikindo, magagamik atemagat, nadawe minwa anishnabe aking. I live in Treaty 1 territory, Manitoba, the homeland of the Red River Métis, and as a guest here in my broken Mohawk and Anishinaabemowin, I acknowledge with respect the traditional territory that the university stands on, the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. And I thank them for their welcome, their stewardship, their leadership, and their teachings so generously shared. And speaking of generously sharing teachings, it's my great honor to call to the stage Alan Dockstader, Elder and Cultural Advisor with the Office of Indigenous Initiatives here at Queen's. Al is from Oneida First Nation of the Thames near London, Ontario, and is a member of the Bear Clan, and we are blessed to have him here, our elder and great teacher and friend, Al Dockstader.
Sekali swagwe ka the host gone young gets quali ni waki the lot when you aga ni you jot. My name is the host gone also what Sheila said, Alan. So anyway, I'm gonna do the opening, what we words before all else. Ano kanu hela dusla. Da is what the Jose yotste ono chi na te hundu. Yoli what they to say goes kaji a head off way no ni quat nago. Jiawe go was gonna you what no Tony. That you don't have to quat nago. Say goes kaji a head off way no ni you quat nago. The yetino la do yuki no ha one jar you say go. You got to what on J do hadi that you don't have you quat nago. Say goes kaji a head off way no ni you quat nago. The yetino lado an egg so hard you say go. You're not really what on J do hadi that you don't have you quat nago. Say goes kaji a head off way no ni you quat nago. You quat nago. The yetino lado. Asana to give that the lady say go. A great go, you not really what on J do hadi that you don't have you got go. Say go is kaji a head or when you got go. That one way la do, canino and days are mahi de J say go. You not really what on J do hadi that you don't have you got go. Sega was kaji head or when only you quat go. The yetino la doom, anu quat to go to Sega. You tell what on J do hadi that you don't have you quat go. Sega was kaji head or when only you quat go. The twat no way la doom, or you quat your way to Sega. You quat stu hadi that you don't have you quat go. Sega was kaji head or when only you quat go. The yetino la doom, you take a long to get to Sega. You tell what on J do hadi that you don't have to go. Sego Skagia, Head of Wenoni, Quatnico, the Yatino Lado, Guntili of Suhachi Sego, Yunquat, the Katun Hadi, Tatia Don Haki Quatnico, Sego Skagia, Head of Wenoni, Quatnico, the Yatino Lado, and Neganos Sagunchi Sego, Yunquat Stuhadi, Tatia Don Haki Quatnico. Sorry. Tatiya don't have you got nickel. Sego Skatia, head of Wenoni got nickel, the Yatino Lado or just 2 hearts, so hard cheese Sego. You got the Katon Hadi, Tatiya don't have you got nickel. Sego Skatia, head of Wenoni got nickel. The Yatino Lado away la Suha cheese Sego. No, Natalie Watan J. Dung Hadi, Tatiya don't have you got nickel. Sego Skatia, head of Wenoni got nickel. The Yatino Lado, Ladiskayon days, Sego. No, Natalie Watan J. Dung Hadi, Tatiya don't have you got nickel. Sego Skatia, head of Wenoni got nickel. The head, what no way la dung, Sunquan, Sunquat Chiha, Nen, one day Geka. We need a lady Sego. Natalie Watan J. Dung Hadi, Tatiya don't have you got nickel. Sego Skatia, head of Wenoni got nickel. The Yatino Lado, you get Satakwa, Sunday Geka. We need a lady Sego. You go to the Watan J. Dung Hadi, Tatido Hakiquanico. Sego Skatia, head of Wenoni Quanico, the Yatino Lado, you disqualunchi Sego. You Natalie Watan J. Dung Hadi, Tatido Hakiquanico. Sego Skatia, head of Wenoni Quanico, the Yatino Lado, Gayeni Hanan, wait the gate, she Sego. You get Nico, Latati, Tatido Hakiquanico. Sego Skatia, head of Wenoni Quatnico, the head was no Lado, second disochi, Aliwa Quego, Lawanada you, Tatiya don't have young Quatnico, the Sulege can Jaqua, Nathaniel Le Waquenin and the Ganu Hela Dusla. Ne got Sutton, Daquatuctum, ne, what Doctor, ne, Squateleji, Nathaniel Le Waquenin and Aloha. Wake one data, Unhadi, Nen. Kanalakum, Agadati, Tatiya don't have name, young Quatnago, Donator.
Yawan Al, and how fortunate we are to have a fluent Mohawk speaker as one of our elders here at Queen's University to remind us of the language first spoken here on these lands. Sheila Rogers, Dishane Kashun, En Michif Nia. Hello, I'm Sheila Rogers, and I'm a broadcast journalist who spent more than 400 years at CBC Radio. And I have the great privilege of being the 16th Chancellor of Queen's University. Peter Quigg, welcome. And Cataraqui, Kingston, is a gathering place and has been for people all over Turtle Island for years and years and years. So it's lovely that we've gathered here in Grand Hall physically, IRL. In real life, I'm just so excited I finally know what that means. And, or virtually online, and welcome to those. A special little shout out to the people who have gathered at Four Directions Indigenous Student Center who are watching this morning. I want to thank Jen Abel, while I remember to do this, for providing sign language interpretation for us today. It is a great honor to host the inaugural Chancellor Emeritus Murray Sinclair Iban Lecture, honoring Murray Sinclair's profound contributions to truth, healing, and reconciliation, to education, to justice, and to honor his enduring legacy. After a year of giving Murray's name and image a rest here at Queen's so that he could make his journey to the other side without interruption, according to his Medewin protocols, we are excited to publicly celebrate his legacy, unveil the vibrant portrait of him painted by Dr. Kent Monkman, and to say his name. He was a man of many names. Mazina Gijik, the one who speaks of pictures in the sky. He was Senator Sinclair, and some of his Senate colleagues are here today, and some are watching online, I know that as well. The Honorable Mr. Justice, Chair Sinclair, brother, husband, father, and we are honored, so deeply honored, that two of his children are with us today, Gijik and Nigan, who will be speaking very soon. I'd also like to say hello to Danae, to Jessica, and to Misko, and the grandchildren who are watching online. Murray was a proud Muslim, a proud grandfather, and on his residence he had a sign on the door, a wooden plaque that said, "Heavy Metal Muslim," because he loved heavy metal as well. He was an uncle, colleague, and with more than 30 honorary doctorates, a doctor. And I understand if this were Germany, we would have to call him doctor. But I think you get the drift. He was a friend and cousin, and he was my cousin, Chancellor of Queen's from 2021 to 2024, and now Chancellor Emeritus. As with all areas of Murray's life, his time here at Queen's was marked by a deep commitment to dialogue, sometimes very difficult conversations, for understanding and positive change for our university, which all begins with listening. As an honorary witness to the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which Murray Sinclair chaired, I watched in action one of the greatest listeners this country has ever known. Murray was my listening idol. He took the thousands of statements he heard from residential school survivors and their families into his heart, his mind, his soul, and his actions. He acted with great humanity, humor. Oh, he loved to tell dad jokes, like the sicker, the better. And I just learned this morning that if you're a non-dad telling dad jokes, what are you? Do you know? A faux pas. You can put it in the bank, okay? He once told me that the teaching of humility tells us that we're not here to dominate or change or destroy creation, but to be part of it and to live in balance with it, with all of its parts. He said, imagine a world in which all people have a profound conviction of the sacredness of all of creation, of the sacredness of all peoples and of themselves, and of the importance of that obligation to live in balance. We would think differently, we would act differently, we would do business differently, and we would govern differently. But Murray Iban asks us to do more than imagine. He calls us to change this world and leave it in better shape for each next generation. While he was revising the 6-volume final report of the TRC in the summer of 2015, Murray visited me and my husband on Gabriola Island, and he came for one night and stayed for 4 weeks. And one of his children came, Gijik came as well, which was fantastic. And about 6 days in, I recorded a little interview with him, and I began by saying, it's been such an honor to have you here. And he said, "Been? Has been? What makes you think I'm leaving?" There's no guarantee of that until you actually see me drive away. And that was true. So we shared meals and coffees. It was wonderful. We went on walks with my schnauzer, Sam, and Murray gave us something very profound, the opportunity to give. And at the end of the national TRC event in Ottawa, He turned to the audience and assembled in the ballroom of the Delta Hotel, and now famously said, "We have described for you a mountain. We've shown you the path to the top. We call upon you to do the climbing." In framing it this way, he has asked us to build a better country, better institutions in this country, to build a new relationship based on mutual respect and to just seize that second chance. To this day, he is giving us the opportunity to give to the future. All we have to do is answer his call. We are fortunate today to have two lecturers. In a moment, we will hear from Murray Iban's son, the esteemed Dr. Nigan Wiwadam Sinclair, Anishinaabe writer, editor, professor, and activist. And we will then hear from the eminent Dr. Danielle Lucier, Red River Métis citizen and Queen's National Scholar and Chair in Indigenous Knowledges and Perspectives. After Dr. Lucier's address, I'm sure you've all been wondering about this. We're going to unveil the portrait of our Chancellor Emeritus by Dr. Kent Monkman. It's a work of national significance, and we're just thrilled that you could all be here, and to you online as well, to witness this. One of the great pleasures I have here at Queen's as the Chancellor is getting to hang with our principal, Patrick Dean. We were noodling away in his office one day last year, mulling over how Queen's could honor Murray's legacy and impact. Yesterday, I asked him to recall the origin story for this event, and he said, well, it came up in conversation with the Chancellor, me. Typically generous of Patrick, but this lecture series is Patrick's idea. Dr. Patrick Dean is the 21st principal of Queen's University, and it was he who invited Murray Sinclair to be our Chancellor. Patrick and Murray's ideas about dialogue and building community intersect and overlap on many, many levels, and the Chancellor Emeritus Lecture Series will continue vital conversations inspired by Murray Sinclair Iban. Please welcome now to our stage our principal, Patrick Dean.
Well, thank you very much, Sheila. Good morning, everyone. It's really wonderful to be with you all today on such an important occasion and to be able to take some time to reflect upon Chancellor Emeritus Sinclair's contributions, not only here at Queen's, but to the country and to the cause of truth and reconciliation in this country. If you'll permit me, I would like to indulge in some personal reminiscences of Murray. And it begins when, in 2001, I took my family to Winnipeg to take up a position at Murray's alma mater, the University of Winnipeg. And I hadn't been there for very long when people began to ask me whether I had yet had the pleasure of meeting Murray Sinclair. I had to say no, I hadn't, and I'm pleased to say, Murray by that point, by the way, had just been appointed to the Court of Queen's Bench of Manitoba, had become the first Indigenous judge in Manitoba, I think, as early as 1988. But I hadn't had the pleasure of meeting Murray, and I'm pleased to say I didn't have the pleasure of meeting him in court. Although everything I've heard from people who did is that it was a very educational experience. I did meet him under very unusual circumstances, and I've told some people about this before, in the halls of Kelvin High School. One evening when my kids were being coached in improv comedy by Murray's son, Nigan. And I remember a conversation with Murray that I will never forget for its humor and intensity. Murray had a gift of, as Sheila said, listening very intently, even in the most trivial encounters. One had a very powerful sense of personal engagement with Murray. And I remember that first meeting in the halls of the school. As it happens, we came to know each other quite well during my years in Winnipeg. our paths intersected on a number of important issues, and it was wonderful to get to know him and to benefit from his advice and thoughtfulness on many complex issues. That meant I was especially delighted when in 2019 I came to Queen's. In the week of my installation, we had a number of honorary degrees given, and one of them was to the Honourable Murray Sinclair. And I remember that very fondly. I don't know why I should have been surprised to find on that occasion that the experience was exactly as it had been at the very first meeting, an intensely personal experience in which frank thoughts were exchanged in good humor, and a great deal of wisdom passed from Murray to me and to others in the conversation. It was that, I think, that emboldened me to approach him in 2020 and 21 about, I think that's when it was, about becoming our Chancellor. And when I asked Murray, the first thing he said was, well, you know, I've been asked many, many times, and I've always said no. And then he said, but I'll say yes. And it was extraordinary. He did characteristically want to go and talk to the family and assure himself that he had his family's support for this. But I would say from that very first conversation, he never wavered. There's a very peculiar relationship between chancellors and principals in this institution. Quite famously, Sir Sandford Fleming, who was chancellor for 35 years, built an extraordinarily close relationship with the person after whom this building is named, George Monroe Grant, who was, I think, principal for 25 of those years. And that set the pattern of very close, mutually supportive relationships between chancellors and principals at this institution. And I feel immensely privileged to have had the benefit of that kind of a relationship with Murray for the all too short 3 years he served as Chancellor. He was amazing on almost every issue. Those were difficult years. If you think back to 21 to 24, we had a number of complex issues come up on which I was very pleased to benefit from his wisdom. What was interesting about Murray, though, is that I recall, and this is what I miss, I think, is how much one learned from him just in the course of ordinary conversation. We would talk about sheep farming, or dogs, or motorbikes, or critical issues, indigenous people in Scandinavia, for example. And regardless of what the topic was, one always learned from Murray. And those conversations were always characterized by the same things: his mischievous humor, his unpredictability. Now, I've shared this story before with people, and I have to share it again because it is quite extraordinary. When we were having a rather fraught conversation on campus about Duncan Campbell Scott and his legacy, and there was a request for the revocation of Duncan Campbell Scott's honorary degree, I called Murray up and I said, give me some advice on this issue. What's your view of Duncan Campbell Scott? And it's utterly, utterly in character that Murray replied in the following way: well, I really enjoy reading his poetry. And then, of course, we moved to talk about Duncan Campbell Scott, the political operative and the architect of the residential school system, on which he had a different point of view. But it was characteristic of Murray that he was able to grant positive recognition while at the same time exercising his fiercely powerful sense of ethics and justice. So as you heard from Sheila, when we began thinking about ways to remember Murray at Queen's, obviously our minds went first to the way in which chancellors are traditionally commemorated through the portrait, and that is an important way to do so. But the idea of this commemorative lecture series came out of that. The idea being every year to feature a speaker who could help advance the conversation of which Murray was a participant and an instigator, to make sure that those conversations could always continue. Lectures on critical issues related to truth, to reconciliation and indigeneity, of course, but also lectures that might help us continue, extend, and further explore the generous, good-humored, and yet uncompromising humanity that was Murray Sinclair's gift to us all. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much, Principal Dean. We're honored to have Dr. Niigaan Sinclair with us today, Anishinaabe scholar, writer, editor, columnist, a one-time great cigarette roller, professor at the university, it's in Winnipeg, it's in your book, at the University of Manitoba, and an activist based in Winnipeg. He is the author of the collection of brilliant essays, Winnipeg, Visions of Canada from an Indigenous Centre. It won the 2024 Governor General's Award, Literary Award, exploring how Winnipeg shifts the Canadian conversation and serves as a reminder that the colonial past isn't even the past. During his father's final speech at the closing TRC event, December of 2015, Murray remarked that his only regret over the years in the TRC that it was in existence was that he spent so much time away from his family. Niigaan is going to talk about what that meant and reflect on the legacy of his father. He calls his talk 10 Lessons from Commissioner Dad. Please welcome Dr. Niigaan Sinclair.
Okay, how's everybody doing out there? Good, here we are. I'm very ill, so I'm gonna do the best I can to not hack up a lung up here. It's been very nice to do a series of events honoring Dad over the past few weeks. Of course, we wanna honor the year protocol that we recognized to let him travel to the West, and now that he is there, we did a wonderful giveaway in November, and so it's nice to be able to both say his name, Mijanagijikaban, but also to be here to honor him with you. I know you all loved him very much, and he loved you very much for being here. So big miigwech for everybody for coming, especially Principal Dean, and of course our cousin Sheila. And there we go, there's the cough right there. So Bojun de Magaduk, Niigaan Webadam de Dish to Cost Namago Shindo Dem, Gigo Dodem, Nimenwendam Omayai, and it's nice to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Dad. I'm going to modify, that speech that I gave was at the Survivors Gathering. They asked me for a title like however many months ago, and I said, I'll do the 10 lessons from Honorable Dad. That's a 1-hour talk, and they've given me like 15 minutes. So you're going to get 4 lessons from Dad. You got the modified version. I like to sort of, I'll bring it all together. Because one of the most important things for me is that you know that the TRC was not Dad's proudest moment. It was not his most important moment. It was not, I would say even, while it is the most public profile, the highest thing that you probably know him about, his proudest thing is probably being Anishinaabe. That's probably by far his most important thing in his life, his lifelong journey that he took to understand ultimately who he is. And he writes about that in his book. He talks about his pursuit of knowledge, of trying to figure out who he is. And so I want to do that. I want to do that process. I remember when I came to we had a big funeral for him at the Canada Life Centre in Winnipeg, which is this huge 15,000 arena, 15,000 seat arena. And of course it's packed and there's thousands of people and everybody flew in. And I was supposed to be the MC that day. I wasn't actually supposed to say a lot. In fact, my daughter was the one who was going to say probably the most. And what I realized at looking at the program and what I realized looking at who was going to speak was that everybody was going to talk about the TRC. And I just want to emphasize how important it is that that is not his career achievement, even though you may have only met him through that process. And of course, it's an important process. But his far biggest achievement was being a strong Anishinaabe Inini, to be a good dad, to be a good nephew, to be a good son, to be a good uncle, and probably most of all, to be a good mushum. That was probably his career goal. And so I want to talk about that. You know, what he talks about is that our ability to figure out who we are as Anishinaabe has been the most dispossessed from us through a whole host of series of policies and procedures and things, attitudes, things that have happened throughout time. The residential school period as being the worst example of that. But really us not understanding our own creation stories, our own heroes, ultimately who we are as a people. And he often talks about what he calls the 4 questions, which are the things that we answer in the lodge for our young people, but many of our young people don't make it to the lodge. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about where does Mijanagijik Iban come from? Where was Mijanagijik going? Why was Mijanagijik here? And ultimately, who was Mijanagijik? And so I'm going to say a few things. I'm going to try to keep within 15 minutes the best that I can. But that you can get to know him a little bit, because you might have seen him in little glimpses and times, but we got to see him, my sister and I, grumpy at 5 in the morning, which was what he was up every single morning, having coffee and sitting out on the patio, and usually doing his Sudoku or doing his crosswords. And so we got to spend a lot of time really reflecting and thinking about, ultimately, where did Mijanagijik come from? Mijanagijik Iban come from? Where did Dad come from? Well, Dad was a refugee. He was a person who, like all of us, experienced land theft and removal by the Canadian state of our community in 1907. And Henry James, who was our great-grandfather, his grandfather, had a small trapline in a place called Breezy Point, which was a place that he took us fishing, me particularly, a lot of time growing up at Breezy Point. He would take us to a trapline that I didn't even know was our family trapline. And that he would spend a lot of time teaching us about space, about what our relationship is like, just north of Selkirk, in what's now a healing center, but at the time was the St. Peter's Indian Settlement, which was a settlement led by Chief Peguis, the original Peguis First Nation. But in 1907, the government of Canada forced us off the land by gunpoint. And so while my great-grandfather, Henry James, moved for a couple years, he eventually gave up his Indian status and moved back to Selkirk, and that's what we grew up. We grew up as non-status Indians until the 1980s when we received our status back. Dad grew up very much in a place in which he had experienced ethnic cleansing, which we often think of in the Middle East, or we think of in Asia, or we think of in Africa, but very much happened right in Manitoba, where we were forced off the land. And my father grew up very much not aware of who he was. Had experienced not only parents and grandparents that had gone to residential schools, but that he himself suffered immense trauma at an early age, losing his mother at the age of 1, Florence. And of course, then being taken in by Granny Kate, Catherine Simard, and Henry James, his grandparents, our great-grandparents, who were very old at that point, and he was allocated to be cared for by Auntie Josephine. Auntie Josephine, who then raised literally my father from the very beginning of the age of 1 all the way until he left for university at the age of 16, because he skipped 2 grades. Dad loved knowledge. He tells a famous story about wanting a bike. He asked every day, can I have a bike? Can I have a bike? And the family, who was struggling financially, living in a home that my great-grandfather literally built from scratch. He was a boat builder, but he was also a home builder. He opened up this big box on Christmas morning. And of course, he thought it was a bike. And he opened it up, and it was a box of encyclopedias, which was literally the most disappointing moment of his life. When we were in hospital, I said to Dad, what's one of the things you're most angry about? He says, I never got the bike. But that book of knowledge, that encyclopedia, he was so angry, instead of like tossing it to the side, he determined to memorize the entire book, which he did. And he began to run out of things to read in the house. And so Henry James, his grandfather, took my father and gave him the newspaper every morning and said, "Read me the newspaper." And he would stand in the kitchen and read my great-grandfather the newspaper. And there's a famous story in our family of my great-grandfather hearing my father read the story of the removal, the forcible military coup of King Farouk of Egypt, who, if you know any of that story, King Farouk was not a good leader. He was a terrible despot who did terrible things to his people, and the military removed him. But my father could not conceive of how people could remove a king. And he kept walking around the house going, "I can't believe what happened to King Farouk. I can't believe what happened to King Farouk." And he said it so many times the family started to call him Farouk. In fact, if you go amongst our family, we had a family gathering just a couple years before my dad passed, and people still call him, "Hey, Farouk," because that was his nickname for his family. My dad loved knowledge, and particularly was fostered to love knowledge by Granny Kate. A lot of people might not know, you see Murray Sinclair and you'll see him as a solitary figure, but the reason that he exists is because of women, and most particularly Granny Kate. But kudos as well to Auntie Josephine, who also raised Dad. And then, of course, all the many other, what they called the big aunties. There was 5 or 6 of them who came along the way. And, of course, the non-related aunties who also came along the way. And then, of course, my sisters, who are really the strength of our family with my mother. It is really my mother and my sisters who are the reason that my dad was a success. Granny Kate, though, raised my dad to be in love with 2 things. One was the church, the Catholic Church in particular, because she was raised with nuns. She was who protected her from sexual physical abuse in Fort Alexander Residential School. So she came out with a bit of a different experience. Her experience was very much that the church wasn't a place of violence, it was a place of opportunity. Because she was also, due to the nuns and the fact that she knew how to cook, she could carry forward her Medewan teachings. And so Dad, through Granny Kate, his grandmother, was able to foster an understanding that there was opportunity for the future to bridge those 2 worlds. And there's a very famous story about my father that he was allocated by Granny Kate when Granny Kate did the most terrible, sinful thing you could possibly do, marry an Anglican, which was my grandfather, Henry. My great-grandfather, Henry James. That when the priest made her promise that she would allocate one of her children or grandchildren to the priesthood or to the nunnery. And of course, Dad became that figure when Dad re-entered into Granny Kate's life, and she started to take care of him. After he lost his parents, my grandfather couldn't care for him, and of course his mother had passed away at the age of 1. Granny Kate said, "Well, here is the priest," and she took him to church 3 times a week. And she cared so deeply about him becoming a priest that when he turned to her at the age of 16, when he was going to university, and said, "I want to go to university, I don't want to go to the priesthood," she cried for 3 days. And she said, "Well, what do you want to become?" He said, "A phys ed teacher." I can only imagine her disappointment over seeing the rise of the son that she had raised to be this worker for the people. And he wanted to become a phys ed teacher. No insult to phys ed teachers, by the way. But she made him promise on that day, as she signed a form to give him permission to go to university, that he would always work for the people. And she said, "You must always work for the people and love the people, especially when they don't love you." And that became a life mantra for Dad. And that's where he came from. The second part. Where did he go? Now, Dad was the first of every room that he walked into. Every classroom, every boardroom, every courtroom. Because he didn't last very long as a phys ed teacher. In fact, Granny Kate got very sick, and he had to quit university, and he began to move back to Selkirk. And you know what he became? You could have easily become the most successful one, but he was terrible at it, a bingo caller. Dad worked at the Friendship Center in Selkirk, and of course met my mother at that time, and he started to build a family. And they needed a job, so they worked at the Friendship Center, and he was the worst bingo caller, legendary, to this day. He called the numbers too slow, and all the grannies in the community were like, "We got to get rid of this guy. Let's make him a lawyer." And one of the people who were on the board of the Friendship Center, who was involved with the Friendship Center, was a man named Howard Pawley, who at the time was the Attorney General of Manitoba and soon to become the NDP Premier in the province. And Howard Pawley took Dad under his wing and encouraged him to go to law school, which he then became a lawyer. Now, Dad said that going to the law school was the most traumatic experience of his life because he not only had to memorize the most racist ideas ever in history, but then he had to regurgitate them every single day. And he had to adhere to them. And he was building an entire career off of the most terrible possible Eurocentric ideas, which are things like Indigenous peoples don't matter, they don't have any land claims, they don't have any rights, and they never contributed anything. And for Dad, this was a very traumatic and difficult experience. And as a young boy watching my father, I would often have him during the nighttime, while my mother worked during the daytime. And I just saw my dad endlessly reading. And he gave up at that point. His real big dream was to become a carpenter. He really loved working with wood. And so that's really what Dad began to do, is he began to see injustice as his life calling. And of course, that led him in many years to doing all the different things that are important. And it's no coincidence that the week that my father determined that he would become a judge, when he was asked by Howard Pawley's government to become a judge, that J.J. Harper, who was a chair of the Island Lakes Tribal Council in 1988, was shot by a Winnipeg police officer in a racially motivated killing. It's no coincidence that my dad, on the same week that he became a judge, was entering the most contentious time in history. And so my dad sort of adopted a mantra from Granny Kate of trying to figure out how do we bridge these worlds in the law, which he had experienced as some of the most racist and terrible place that he could possibly be, but he didn't see that as a place of endings, he saw that as a place of opportunity. And let me tell you, on his very first day as a judge, he walked into the law courts, and they had sort of a tea and sandwich thing with the other judges. And on his very first day, he had his sandwich and he had his tea, and he had a long braid in those days. So he definitely didn't look like the bench, which was full of old white men. And so when he walked into that room, the judges were actually debating on that day whether J.J. Harper had been killed due to racism. And of course, the judges, who had very little experience with understanding that police officers possibly could be racist, one of the judges looked at my father and was, a little bit uncomfortable, perhaps, with seeing an Indigenous judge, a late 30-year-old, who had been also appointed the associate chief judge as kind of a moment of which was predominantly for scheduling, but it was also for disciplinary. And so for many of these older judges, perhaps they wanted to put him in his place. But one of the judges turned to the other judge and said, "Oh, we don't got to worry about racism anymore, boys. We got an Indian judge now because we feel bad." It was a profound moment of what we now call anti-DEI, or the claim that Dad's only there because he's an Indian, and we all feel sort of bad and guilty, and so that's why we brought him to the bench. Well, my dad had a moment in that, and he probably thought back to Granny Kate, and he probably thought back to all the things that were necessary, of the things that he had learned. And he had many choices. Like, what were the choices he could do at that point? He could have taken his finger, he could have put him in the guy's chest and said, "Oh, you're a racist," or could have taken his tea and tossed it in his face. He could have walked out of the room on his first day as a judge, but what would have proved from any of those things? And what Dad did was, he said very loudly so all the judges could hear, he said, "I may be here because I'm an Indian, but you're here because you're a white guy. And what does that mean for all of us?" And that, my friend, is called sass. That's my dad's career. In that moment is precisely where Dad took that spirit forward, which was to be a truth teller, but to be a little bit sassy. And to remember probably the most important thing of all, which is that when you are the first in a room, you're not going to change that room. What you are going to do is to make that room different, and you're going to open the door for others. This year, at the University of Manitoba, we have 3,482 First Nations Inuit Métis students. That is the largest on-campus community in history. There has never been a larger group of Indigenous young people who are entering the professions of teaching, nursing, medical, criminologist, psychologist, and of course, law. Dad used to walk around campus as the only Indigenous person he ever saw. There was a few of them, Ovid McCurdy, Phil Fontaine, Marion Meadmore. In fact, they were older than him. They were building the road for him. But he knew that when he walked in that back room in the courts, that he had to help the rest of us get in there. He had to help the rest of us become the critical mass. And that's what became Dad's mantra. What became Dad's mantra was the big question of, why am I here? And you know, probably the most defining feature of what led Dad's second half of his life was when he was 56 years old, which I am I'm screeching towards. But it was when Dad woke up in the morning one day, and he felt very dizzy, he felt very confused, and he had had a stroke. Now, he had just become a grandfather. For the very first time, he had become a grandfather when my daughter Sarah Nimiji Nibekwe had been born. And so this was a big moment of humanity for Dad, because he had just finished the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. He had just been appointed to the Court of Queen's Bench. And of course, he continued to be a first. But I think that was a moment of humanity for him, in which he realized that being a grandfather meant that he had to build a path forward into the future. Because it wasn't just about building a past, building a present, it was about building something into the future. And uncoincidentally, just a few years later, he got asked to be a part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, he was not the first choice. He was actually chosen after the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission had epically and spectacularly failed. And in many ways, the TRC was expected to fail generally, to sort of go away and fade into nothing. Even though the survivors and many members of the church and the government worked very, very hard to try to create some kind of process which was not going to be a government commission, it was going to be a community commission led by survivors, paid for by survivors. The TRC was never paid for by the government or led by the churches. It was absolutely led by survivors. And when they failed, the survivors took it over and said, well, we're going to make sure that the commissioners are people chosen from the community, people chosen from all of us, collectively, unanimously. And the first choice that they had was my father, who was invited to become the head commissioner and said immediately no. He had to be asked a number of times and conferring with our family to become the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I remember that meeting that we had where perhaps we thought this would be a 2 or 3 year, or maybe even a 5-year of the mandate process in which Dad would be away for a little while, but he wouldn't be away forever. And how wrong we were. And for me, that became kind of a turning point moment for me, because at that point I was a father. And I spent most of my life away from my father, watching my dad be an uncle to the country, much more so than he was a father to me. And when I saw my father take upon himself the hardest commission in this country's history, with Chief Wilton Littlechild and Dr. Marie Wilson, it began a moment in which I had to really figure out what it's like to grow up without a dad, watching a dad from afar. And that's a long process to reconcile that. That's a hard process. And only recently, in the past 15 years or so, have I really began to understand that Dad wasn't just doing that for you, but he was doing that for me. Because he was realizing through that stroke that doing that work for his granddaughter was very much what the TRC was about. It was about young Indigenous peoples. And for those of us who know Dad, know that he always kept 5 $20 bills in his pocket all the time. Because whenever he met people, especially young people, they would be like, hey, can you read this thing? Or hey, can you come to this event? Or hey, can you help me out with this thing? And he'd be like, well, I got to run to this other thing, but here's $20. And Dad was endlessly doing that, and it drove us crazy. It drove us crazy because Dad was like endlessly committing to young people, giving them a lot of money, giving them a lot of time, giving them a lot of resources. Because he really believed that it is through young people that our future will be asserted, that are through young people, and not just Indigenous young people, through Canadian young people, that we have to commit more than ever. And we have done that. My daughter told me a story one time. She said, "Hey, Daddy, I want to dance jingle dress at the school assembly." And I said, "That's a terrible idea." And she said, "I'm going to do it anyways, because if you know a 14-year-old, that's kind of how it goes." I said, "But what if somebody says something racist to you, or what if somebody does something, or what if teacher says something terrible to you that makes you feel ashamed?" Which that's what happened to me when I was in school. I had a lot of teachers who would say some pretty harmful things, not because they're bad people, but they learned bad things, especially about Native people. And she said, "Daddy, my friends asked me, and if anything happens, they'll get them." My dad was so proud of that story. Because you know what he realized? Is that by investing in Canadian young people, that they got her back. That she needs to be taught that she's not alone. And that brings me to the last part of Dad. The last part of Dad is, who really was Dad? Well, he was sassy. He opened the door for all of us. And he made sure that all of us would be in a room together. I said to Dad one time, I said, "What is reconciliation really? Like, what is it?" And I was a bit fired up, and I expected a kind of academic answer. He said, "The key to reconciliation is to stay in the room." He said, "That's the most important thing. Because staying in the room is easy when you get along. Staying in the room is fine when you're eating and visiting. But staying in the room when you disagree, committing to each other, that's the test of reconciliation. Can you commit to staying in the room together?" And I want you to look around in this room right now. People from different disciplines, politics. I'm going to guarantee that none of you voted the same. None of you probably have the same literature that you read or the same music that you listen to. None of you probably did what Dad did. I remember I left the hospital one night. It was about midnight, and we'd been visiting all day. And I said to Dad, "Do you want me to put music on for you?" And he said, I said, "Yeah." He said, "Yeah, put some music on for me." I said, "Do you want some nice?" I'd set up a little playlist of like sort of melodious, like instrumental music. He's like, No, I want AC/DC Back in Black." Dad went to sleep listening to AC/DC and Pink Floyd. And one of the things that we did at the funeral for Dad was he became a biker at the age of 70, which, like, who the heck does that? But he got to be escorted by a group of bikers to the funeral site, and what a great gift for him to finally get his own motorcycle gang. And they played AC/DC all the way down the highway. My dad said in his final speech at the TRC, not his final speech, his final public speech was actually at the first Orange Shirt Day in Ottawa. That was his final event. He got COVID on that trip, and he came home, and he was very, very ill, and he never really traveled again. And we're very happy that he spent the last 4 or 5 years with us. We actually got Dad at the very end. We got to have him back. But during that final speech at the TRC, he said, Sheila said it there, "We have shown you the mountain, now we call upon you to do the climbing." Notice that in that speech, he did not say, "We now call upon Justin Trudeau to do the climbing," or Negon Sinclair to do the climbing, or insert whoever we decide this week is going to be the leader, or the visionary, or the person we're going to put on all the posters, or the person that we're going to show on social media. You know what he said? He said, "We call upon you to do the climbing." Because he did not put all of his time, effort, his life, not just away from us, but all of his energy, his health, and his commitment for nothing. He came to every courtroom, boardroom, classroom. He came to Queen's University at the very late stages of his life when he was perhaps at the weakest, because he truly believed that if we just spent enough time together, if we just learned from one another, if we just believed in one another and stood one another and got each other's back, especially when we don't agree, that we can do anything. That's what Dad was all about. Miigwech, and thank you very much for your time.
Chimigwech, cousin. I think about the SAS, and I was hosting a media conference when the TRC was about to meet in Vancouver, and like Nigon, I thought I'd just go without notes, which you do so beautifully, so impressively, and so did your dad. And of course, in doing so, there was something I forgot to say. I acknowledged 2 of the 3 First Nations on whose lands Vancouver is built, the Squamish and the Musqueam. I forgot the Tsleil-Waututh. So, okay, that's fine. And Murray came up after me and said, something was missing. And he said, I also want to honor the Tsleil-Waututh. And he said, that's what happens when you go without notes. And I was sitting right in front of him and I said, I was going commando. And he said, that's not going commando. That's improvising. And I didn't know, I still didn't know what going commando was. And then he said, would you like me to go commando? And then he just sort of fooled around with his belt for a second. And anyway, then I said, perhaps not right now. He was sassy, he was fun, and as Nigon said, as Patrick said, so capable of carrying that humor in difficult rooms. And I'm very grateful for your words today, Cuz. When I became chancellor here, the very first meeting that I had was with our elder, Al, at the Indigenous Gathering Space. And one of the first people I met after Al was Dr. Danielle Lucier, who I was so afraid to follow in the footsteps, in the fluvogs of my cousin Murray. And she just embraced me wholly and wholeheartheartedly, and has been there and had my back as chancellor, and I value that so much. Danielle is Red River Métis and a citizen of the Manitoba Métis Federation, born and raised in the homeland of the Métis Nation on Treaty 1 territory. She's a bead worker, a mother to 3 fabulous children who are with us today, Hugo, Rosie, and Opal. We're so glad that you're here. And she's a killer Uno player as well. She currently serves as Queen's National Scholar and Chair in Indigenous Knowledges and Perspectives. And she will share reflections from her perspective as a mom, a teacher, and Queen's community member on relationships, reconciliation, and legacies that linger. Please welcome Dr. Danielle Lucier.
I'm 0% going commando. There's a script. Whew. Okay. I'm sorry, there are a couple of F-bombs. So you have to prepare yourself. Okay. I did warn Nick that was happening. Okay, so those of you who know me know that despite any outward appearance, I actually don't like speaking in public. Shocking. My learners in my classes will know from my many pep talks before I make them stand up in class that when I was in university, and especially when I was in law school, I chose all my classes based on which ones didn't have public speaking. Truly. As someone who has been called upon to lead, the way that I manage the stress and the nervousness around this is I write these really intense speeches, and I toil for hours and days and weeks over my scripts. My partner, who's also an academic at first, was shocked at how long I spend preparing for even a short engagement, and my kids will frequently stumble upon me talking to myself as I dictate into my notes app and then edit late into the night. Part of this is the imposter syndrome that runs deep for many Indigenous folks who move through these spaces that were not designed by us or for us, and in fact were often designed specifically to exclude us. And that imposter syndrome is further bolstered and encouraged through structural forces and individual actions taken in the spaces where I am called to lead. But anyway, once I have a script that I'm happy with, the kids will tell you that I practice. In practice, I have this captive audience at my kitchen table. It's super handy. I should have had more. Or I'll get on Zoom with my nieces and my alum. And it is a very rare occasion indeed. I could never be Dr. Sinclair. That's a very rare occasion that I say anything at all or put any words in public that haven't gone through both a kindness read or two or three, and often a check from my legal counsel. My learners, and there's a whole group of learners who are here today. Thank you for coming. Over here too. I spread the learners out so I could look at y'all. My learners will tell you that I begin most learning engagements by having them read a blog post by Dr. Adrienne Keene from her blog, Native Appropriations. And it's a post called Consenting to Learn in Public. And that's exactly what it sounds like. By having the learners reflect on this idea of being brave and making mistakes and learning in public, we set the stage for productive intellectual and emotional growth over the course of the term. And I push learners to be brave, borrowing language from Dr. Sean Wilson to build new relationships to ideas, and then to borrow language from the commissioners of the TRC, building new relationships to each other. So when I received the initial invitation to speak to you today, I was taking a quiet moment. It was a break from marking. And I was marking Anne's paper. Anne's in the third row with Freddie. Hi, Freddie. Sorry, bud. He's 16, he took a day off school to be here today to hear Nigan. Yesterday in class, Anne said, I'm really actually coming for Nigan, and I said, cool. So I was taking a break and reading this book. It is a new poetry collection by Katarina Vermette from Winnipeg. And I'm going to quote the excerpt of the description of the book from House of Anansi Press, because this is really important. This book presents a series of poems that reaches into what it means to be at once a descendant and a future ancestor, exploring the connections that we have between one another and ourselves amongst friends within families. And the book is about being part of one in the large genealogy, a lineage being a line, and the procession, whether in celebration or in mourning, is ongoing. And it felt a little on the nose that when I received the email, I was specifically reading a poem called Things You Can Say About Me When I'm Dead. Now, normally I would leave it there and let you all Google that after. But in this case, it's worth reading aloud, and I know that poetry is not for everyone, so just stick with me here. I come back to it in the end. Katarina Vermette's Things You Can Say About Me When I Am Dead really did stick her feet in a lot of oceans, no euphemisms, had a lot of kids, 4, loved them fiercely, mama bear-like, had magic, and magic really did, was blessed, knew it. Made up stories in her head, some amused her, some healed things, wrote them down, others read them. Hopes they were maybe amused, healed. really sucked at being a good wife. So much. Secretly, not so secretly, wanted a good wife of her own, was suspicious of the actual existence of said good wife, found her purpose relatively early, tried to outrun it, tried to smoke it out, drown it out. Always found her, though. Liked being alone, was always scurrying off away from parties and friends and events and husbands. Held trauma, strength, joy, was rather hyper-independent, at times a complete energy vampire, sometimes took too much, sometimes gave too much emotionally and in narrative. If she hurt you, she hopes you can forgive her. If you hurt her, no, she has forgiven you, except you. Fuck you. That's the first one. Climbed a lot of mountains, literal and figural. Okay, only a moderate amount of mountains, mostly labeled easy. Was so often lonely, sad, grateful, gleeful. Struggled with self-care, self-esteem, all the selves struggled inside her, fought like a family at dinner, bickering, feeding, loving, indifferent, ignoring one another, descending into silence as they digested, and learned life really got going when she embraced the contradiction of it all. Strove to honor those who came before, make space for those after, be a good ancestor, and be a good kid. Failed a lot, tried again, still rose, if you will, journeyed far, literal and figural. Was constant in her heart, if never in her mind. If she loved you, she still loves you, except you, fuck you. Her grandmothers were always with her every day, and she was absolutely terrified all of the time and did it anyway. So I was sitting there with Anne's paper, this out-of-the-blue invitation, a generalized discomfort with public speaking. I'm sweating. A deep-seated sense of imposter syndrome, a lack of feeling of belonging in the university, and this stack of assignments for my Indigenous Research Methods course, where Anne and her peers had clearly demonstrated that they had taken my call to consent to learn in public and be brave to heart. So I agreed to speak. And I'm going to be honest and upfront that I wrote 5 different speeches for our time together today because I couldn't get it right. And the first one I wrote in a rush of words and in haste because when I was originally invited to give the talk, we were on very short notice and it was scheduled in November, right in exams, kind of. It was very challenging. And I thought, perhaps I continue to think, that perhaps what was expected of me when the invitation was issued is that I would stand up on stage and I would eulogize your dad. And I would eulogize this larger-than-life person, and I would use the eulogy as a springboard to talk about all the positive things that have happened or are happening here at Queen's. And that's basically what I did with that first draft. I wrote this giant list of accomplishments, and the TRC wasn't at the top. I talked about the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba and how that was the reason I became a lawyer. And then, of course, I rolled in to talk about the TRC, and I'm a lawyer, so I walked people through how it was set up and the class action and the settlement agreement. And I talked about the mandate of the TRC and all the things that came out of it. And then at one point, I decided there was going to be a PowerPoint. And I found this picture of your dad with the final report, to hammer home what it must have cost. And then it felt not good. I didn't feel good. It felt inauthentic, and I texted Sheila, and I wasn't happy, and we were on the phone. And one of my biggest concerns was that if in 2026 I had to stand up here and tell you why the legacy of Murray Sinclair Iban was important, I wasn't going to make a dent in that in a 20-minute talk. I think they gave me 30 minutes, but this is going to take the time it takes. Sorry, Sheila. So I opened a fresh document and I started writing a second talk, a different talk, this time focusing almost exclusively on the notion of reconciliation, specifically reconciliation as it relates to life in universities. Now, of course, the word reconciliation, this is not neutral. If you go look up in the dictionary the definition of reconciliation, it usually starts with the Roman Catholic sacrament of penance. And then usually near the end, there's the act of causing two groups to become friendly again after an argument, with a bunch of interpretations in between. So the second version of the talk was about situating the idea of reconciliation as developed by the commissioners of the TRC. And I focused on establishing or arguing for, because I felt that I still needed to do that in 2026, arguing for the expertise of Marie Sinclair Iban and his colleagues who spent half a generation, a whole generation, traveling on behalf of all Canadians, bearing witness on behalf of all Canadians, and writing this final report to stand as the roadmap for all Canadians. And I reflected on what that must have cost their families. So my learners, I see Gabrielle, I see Liv. Anybody who's been in my classes will know that I throw this quote up on the screen at least once a semester. It's an excerpt from the executive summary of the final report of the TRC, wherein the commissioners define reconciliation. And they said, to some people, reconciliation is the re-establishment of a conciliatory state. However, this is a state that many Aboriginal people assert has never existed between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. They went on to say to others, reconciliation in the context of Indian residential schools is similar to dealing with a situation of family violence. It's about coming to terms with the events of the past in a manner that overcomes conflict and establishes healthy and respectful relationships amongst people going forward. And then they give you the map. There are 4 bullets. To the Commission, reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining relationships. In order for that to happen, there has to be awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. It's not hard, huh? 4 points. And yet, before sustainable change can occur, there has to be that moment of reckoning. There can be no reconciliation before there is truth. So we have to abandon defensive stances and adversarial stances. And we also need to each claim our investment in the colonial project. And by leaving denial behind and taking responsibility for managing the feelings that accompany unlearning, then we can move forward. So I did all of this, and I was on page 12 of the draft, and I said, okay, so now we're at Queen's, and I pulled out the Extending the Rafters report. And the Extending the Rafters report in 2017 was the final report of Queen's University's TRC task force. And in the report, 25 recommendations were made to, I skipped ahead, to build better relations with Indigenous communities by integrating Indigenous histories, knowledge, and perspectives into the university's ethos, aiming for institutional change and fostering a welcoming, culturally validating environment. And then I pulled out all the reports reporting on the progress to those 25 recommendations. And then I pulled out the identity inquiry report. And I became overwhelmed and the whole talk fell apart. It was such a disaster. because suddenly I was buried in pages and pages of calls to action and recommendations and follow-ups and calendars showing days and months and years that had passed with sometimes slow and sometimes no progress at all towards building new relationships grounded in a common understanding of truth, towards increasing belonging for Indigenous folks in these spaces that were not designed by us or with us in mind. So I opened a new document, Takes 3, no time to waste. And that document sat empty, and my anxiety started to mount, because at the end of the day, what I came here to do was honor the legacy and the work of this person whose leadership and lifelong efforts to improve the lives of me and my children and all my relatives had such a profound influence on my own life and on the lives of people around me. And that's when I ran into Nigan. So I warned Nigan that I was going to tell some stories about him, like 5 minutes before the talk, sorry. So I ran into Nigan at 2 Rideau Street, which is in Ottawa. It's the temporary home of the Senate of Canada, offering some context. So before today, I've met Nigan Sinclair twice. The first time was during a challenging period of my life when I found myself somewhat accidentally the Associate Vice Principal of the Royal Military College of Canada. And when I began at RMC, it became apparent quite quickly that the institution was at the beginning of its efforts. And there was one day I was super discouraged, and I ended up in the office of a colleague, and this colleague is a very problem-solving-y individual, yeah? And she said, "What do you need? How can I help? What can I do to support you as the Indigenous person in the room? What can we do?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." I was crying, it was ugly. And she said, "What if we brought in a speaker? Who could we invite to come talk to us and get us thinking in the right direction?" Thinking, not moving. It was still the imagination phase of reconciliation. And the first thing that came out of my mouth, because I had just read an op-ed in the Winnipeg Free Press that morning, was, "Wouldn't it be great if you could ask Nigan Sinclair?" I thought it would change the vibe, right? It was time. I knew from reading his work and later from reading his book that he is not hesitating to name challenging problems, but also to offer pathways forward, a living legacy from the generations before him, probably. But I dried my eyes and I left my office and I went about my business, because that's what Indigenous people trying to do hard things in challenging spaces do. There's not a lot of time to sit around and feel bad and worry, because as I've said before in other contexts, and I'll say it again here, we can't simply strike a match and light the Western institutions on fire to start from scratch, because there are learners in the building. So I did teaching and I did research and I tried to work within these very small and confined spheres of where I could to improve things. And then I get this call and she said, "Great news, Nigan is coming. And he's gonna be here on this date." You don't remember this, you weren't there. "We're gonna be here on this date, and he's gonna talk to this group of people and that group of people, and he's gonna give this lecture, and if you like, he'll even come to your classes." And I said, "Oh, okay." And that's how it came to be that the first time we met was on a military base, in a classroom filled with cadets, listening to Nigan talk about Indigenous representation in comic books. And it was excellent. And then after that, we were in a smaller room with mostly Indigenous cadets, and I will never forget the conversation that we had, because Nigan said to these young people, who were all sitting there for their own reasons, with their own motivations and living their own challenges, that they needed to continue to show up, because we were needed in every room. Because we're needed in every room. from land defenders to learners in universities to Indigenous folks in the Canadian Armed Forces. And this is so important. It is insufficient to have tokenistic inclusion like Indigenous council tables and Indigenous advisory groups. Those spaces are important for us, but we also need to seek to create space in every room. And this is something that I think about as I continue to navigate university spaces. And I think it might be helpful to think about for everybody here. When you sit down in a meeting, ask yourself, are there Indigenous people in this room? And if not, why not? By actively turning your mind to these questions, it may shed light on how systemically we are excluded from these spaces. Put another way, I would ask you, how many rooms would you need to excuse yourself from if you declined to participate in meetings that did not have Indigenous voices included? My partner tried it. It was 100% of the meetings. So I'll let everybody mull that over, and I'm fast forwarding to the second time I met Nigan Sinclair, which was just a few short months ago when we were invited by an independent senator from Manitoba to, the email that I checked before I came here was to advise her and her colleagues on the future of democracy in Canada. Oh, and when these things happen, when I find myself in fancy rooms with fancy people sitting beside Dr. Nigan Sinclair being asked my opinion on democratic resilience and lowering the voting age, I have to shake myself a little and wonder how I got from where I came from to here. But I won't digress too far. On that second time I met Nigan, after we had had a chance to speak, there was a small break. And I remember, it's really funny what you remember from these interactions. I remember there was a bowl of French onion soup without cheese because lactose intolerance. And I turned to Nigan and I said, I'm at Queen's now, and I've been asked to give a lecture named for your dad. And with kindness, Nigan suggested that I focus on truth-telling. Is that fair? In the end, truth-telling, I think, is what underpins the entire legacy of Murray Sinclair Ban. And that short discussion actually resulted in me drafting an entire third talk, dictating into my phone on the drive back from Ottawa. And it was mostly about the state of post-secondary education as it relates to both Indigenous learners and opportunities for non-Indigenous people to learn about and with us. And I dictated pages and pages and pages of ideas on the costs of rising to the calls to action, costs that are mostly borne by Indigenous people who are brought into spaces to do the work, often only to find very surface level commitments and systemic barriers to making systemic change. And I spoke about how this work is often shouldered by women, and how I have seen countless Indigenous women experience devastating burnout in their efforts to move the needle and make space for Indigenous ways of knowing in Western education. And then somewhere around the 401 on-ramp, I started to do a cost-benefit analysis of these efforts. And the draft was quite nonlinear and had more than 2 F-bombs, so it wasn't appropriate for today. But it got me thinking about the fourth version of this talk. I consider it to be a responsibility as a mom, as an academic auntie, as one of the first Métis women to have earned the various credentials that I hold. Law school was violent for me too. As one of the second generation, maybe if we're being optimistic, the third generation of Indigenous professors in universities, I consider it to be a responsibility to use every ounce of privilege I have to kick open the door for the kids coming behind me. In this, I am definitely not alone, and I'm not a trailblazer. I am following in the footsteps of better women than me, more patient women than me, who have modeled how to resist and lead with love. And in so many ways, it's been easier for me than those who came before me, beyond the fact that I can stand on the shoulders of the giants who have advocated for and within education systems, from Murray Sinclair Iban to Marie Baptiste and Trish Montour and Dr. Sheila Cote-Meek. I also benefit from a tremendous amount of privilege. I grew up in a single-parent family, and my mom, she's a character, she's amazing, and she made it her singular mission to get me to university. And when I was a teenager, this literally meant dragging me, because it was not an obvious endeavor, and at the time I really resented it. But man, what a privilege it was to be raised by such a fierce Métis woman. Further, as anyone can see, I am very white-coded, which means that as I move through the world, people react to me first as a woman before they react to me as an Indigenous person. So practically what this means is that when I am not in regalia, people don't follow me around the aisles of the drugstore when I stop on the way to work, right? In theory, I could walk into a police station with fewer worries about being held as an accused when I'm trying to report a crime. I live in a city and I don't need to boil my water before I come to work, and this is not true about many of my colleagues. I have tenure, which is not true about many of my colleagues. And with that privilege comes a responsibility to use it. So in that fourth version, I started to look at the body of written work generated by your dad. And I started to draw out all the themes, from the need for justice reform, to urgent calls for education, to confronting ongoing genocide and racism head on, through to the need for all members of society to participate in a collective actioning of imagining a more just and equitable society where our basic humanity is no longer in question. We can take away a number of things from Murray Sinclair Iban's written reflections later in life and from the talk that Nigan gave today, including the tremendous cost that Indigenous people are paying to attempt to move the needle and change the systems that cause and continue to cause harm to Indigenous people. The lasting legacy of the works, many works, of Murray Sinclair Iban will, I have no doubt, continue to resonate across generations for Indigenous folks. But I worry, and I know that I'm not alone in this either, that his name and his work and his many sacrifices are not always respected or honored in the ways they should be. I've personally been at events where his words are quoted and profoundly misinterpreted. I've been in rooms where I've been immediately accused of being difficult to work with when I quote him and seek better situations for Indigenous learners and their non-Indigenous peers. And the reality from my perspective is that universities are not yet spaces that foster welcoming, culturally validating environments for Indigenous folks. Often institutions are outwardly on board with reconciliation in theory until they have to give something up, whether that be time, energy, space, control, dollars. And this is a concern that I carry in my own interactions with so many institutions, and that I hear in whispers from colleagues from coast to coast to coast, that efforts to bring broad-scale changes may be met with initial enthusiasm that often peters out when folks realize that disrupting the status quo is disruptive. And then my concerns are reconfirmed every single semester when, without fail, an Indigenous learner will come up to me at the end of term and share that my classroom was one of few or perhaps the only space where they felt safe enough to learn during their time in post-secondary. Or when I have a Mohawk graduate learner studying under my care and I watch them struggle against university policies that do not allow them to earn credit for language courses they are attempting to take because their language was stolen from them by colonialism. They can't even get credit, even though they're paying tuition to buy back their languages. And then it's further highlighted. It's not the same as the University of Manitoba. It's further highlighted by devastating application, admission, and enrollment declines for Indigenous learners. And they're numbers that I'm too disheartened to share here, but that speak to systemic challenges that Indigenous people are facing in post-secondary ed. To borrow the language offered to us by Murray Sinclair and his colleagues, I would suggest that the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in universities is not a mutually respectful one. But I need to believe we can get there, and I need to believe we can maintain it when we do. And then beyond the university, to draw on the language of Dr. Ava Jewell, writing for the Yellowhead Institute in 2024, the Canadian Reconciliation Dial, the metric by which the Institute was measuring progress towards fulfilling the 94 calls to action of the TRC, issued now more than a decade ago, hovers somewhere around 14. Dr. Jewell very succinctly states, and I'm quoting because it's important, reconciliation, already an unthinkably generous gesture to offer a violently colonial state by the survivors of its genocide, was always at risk of becoming purely spectacle. In this way, popular notions of reconciliation are disconnected from the lived experiences of Indigenous communities, an abstract promise of change that doubles as reassurance for the Canadian public. So we were talking about the dial last night during like the fourth kitchen table run. My daughter said, "What does move the needle mean?" We talked about the dial. If the dial is stuck and we wish to move beyond window dressing and abstraction, where does it leave us? Paralyzed or unable to move forward? And I worry about this disconnect and this potential for spectacle, and it nags at my heart and my mind daily, but certainly the answer cannot be that we simply give up. We must draw on the strength from the legacy and leadership of Murray Sinclair Bunn. And here at Queen's, this institution benefits from a remarkable brain trust of Indigenous teachers and thinkers and leaders, a great number of whom were recruited through a cluster hire process in 2024. And those new colleagues and my existing colleagues push every single day within their spheres of influence and control to facilitate both learning and unlearning, and to foster and nurture these nascent relationships grounded in this common understanding of truth. Many of us have children. Many of our children are under 10. And we are required to temporarily set aside relationships with our children in order to facilitate this work. Make no mistake, we're on loan to you. And our children are shouldering the weight of our efforts to offer non-Indigenous learners the opportunity to learn and to try and create spaces for Indigenous learners to move beyond survival and into a space of thriving. And even though we're scared, we must do it anyway because the alternative is unconscionable. Our hearts are not yet on the ground, and we must continue to labor for our children and the kids who are coming after them. And the bar was set by your dad, and it was really high. And I am certain that it came with considerable personal sacrifice beyond what you've shared with us today. But he led by example, insisting on the relationships and the education and the hope, and consistently and relentlessly showing up for the next generations. And that, I think, after you guys and your kids, is probably one of the most important legacies of your dad's work. I know that I will and my colleagues will, and the big anti-energy from some of our previous colleagues. We're gonna keep showing up every day to try and act as driving forces for systems change, but I'm gently gonna offer that the Indigenous folks at Queen's University could use some help. I feel the urgency, but not necessarily the nurturance required to properly support the work and do it well. Learners in my classes will tell you that after Dr. Adrienne Klein's blog post, my second most assigned reading is an article by Dr. Tracy Lindbergh. She wrote the book Birdie, and more recently the book The Cree Word for Love. And in this article, she reflects on what was then 5 years of efforts towards rising to the calls to action in university contexts. And the reason I assign this article is because it articulates in a most profound way what allyship needs to look like in universities in order for it to be respectful, sustainable, and transformative. And it's grounded in the idea of consenting to learn in public. Dr. Lindbergh said, "You are going to have to be a fool for love. You are going to have to ask stupid and hard questions, and you're going to have to figure out how to find out what you need to know without being extractivist or opportunist. You may need to do this and learn to do this meaningfully because we may be too sad to do anything but feel. You do not get to lead or trample. Just gather the materials for the build so we can do it when we are well." And then she said, "You are going to need to love Indigenous people so much and want your kids to love Indigenous people so much that you commit to finding out what Indigenous laws, traditions, processes, protocols, truths, philosophies, and ways to mourn are. You will need to love law," she's a lawyer too, "so much that you suspend your disbelief, decolonize your education, open your mind to the possibility that colonization is a thing that is happening, and you are going to learn it, deconstruct it, replace it, and support the work of Indigenous peoples in our rebuild. You are going to need to be a traitor, because allyship is not enough." Dr. Lindbergh is calling for learning that leads to action, action that will center and support Indigenous leadership as we work to imagine a new future guided by the life work of Murray Sinclair Iban. And as long as we continue to benefit from his generosity, Dr. Sinclair and his sisters and his daughter and his nieces and nephews. Dr. Lindbergh tells us that the institutional timelines may not be the same timelines as those required by Indigenous leaders to do the work that is required in a good way, in a healthy way, in a sustainable way. But it is a call for nurturance and love and recognition and respect for Indigenous people as human beings. Nurture us, respect us, give us the space and the resources we need to lead. Consent to learn in public and own up to your mistakes so that we can move forward together. Help us kick in the door and then hold it open so we don't get crushed as we lead the way through it. We owe it to the memory of Murray Sinclair Iban, to those who walked before and those who are following in the procession, to seek to achieve better relationships in these spaces of learning. Only once the relationships are balanced can we turn our minds to how to maintain them. And this work of unlearning and building new relationships that sometimes feel so heavy and complicated and fraught is really quite simple. If we seek to honor those who came before, to make space for those after, to be good ancestors, and to be good kids. I think that we can get there, and I believe we will be able to maintain it. Merci. Kichi Marcy, Dr. Lucier. Thank you to both our truth tellers today. And we come to the point where we're going to unveil the portrait. The brilliant key artist Kent Monkman creates work with a view to entering the canon of art history and to painting the missing narratives, making art that has longevity, that will transcend, art that will speak to the present, art that will speak to the future, and what his alter ego, mischief, eagle testicle, calls past, present, future, all one word, beautiful. The paintings of Kent Monkman, as our two speakers this morning have, remind us that there are other ways of being in this world, on the land and with each other. Kent has brought the Indigenous gaze to the pre-existing European Eurocentric vision, which so often featured Indigenous people subjugated by settlers or not in the landscape at all, following on the heels of the doctrine of discovery. He brought mischief to many of his paintings. I think of the iconic Canadian images of the Fathers of Confederation, where he plants his alter ego, Mischief, on a settee covered by a Hudson Bay blanket, looking at the Fathers of Confederation and wearing only her Louboutin, her red-soled Louboutin stilettos. And he calls this painting The Daddies. Kent Monkman received an honorary degree from Queen's when I was installed as Chancellor, becoming Dr. Monkman. Murray knew he was going to receive this honor and was very pleased, partly because he had chosen Kent Monkman to paint his portrait, and at the same time, Murray was at the top of Kent's list of subjects for his Shining Stars series of personal Indigenous heroes. Such a happy confluence. Queen's is acquiring it's called the Honorable Senator Emeritus Murray Sinclair portrait directly from Dr. Workman. And on behalf of the university, I thank the Agnes Etherington Art Gallery and their team for taking such good care of it, for the documentation, stewardship, and for helping coordinate the imminent unveiling. Our Chancellor Emeritus is set against a sky-filled background, referencing his Ojibwe name, Majina Gijik, the one who speaks of pictures in the sky, and shows Murray wearing the Chancellor regalia with the Queen's crest and the floral beadwork stole designed and created by his daughter, Danae Sinclair, for his installation. I would now like to call upon Principal Patrick Dean to help me unveil the portrait, and I would like to welcome Nigan and Gajik to come and witness the unveiling of the Honorable Senator Emeritus Murray Sinclair, painted by Dr. Kent Monkman, Portrait of a Hero.
Egon, I'm sorry. Everything you say is material. He said it would look very nice in his new living room. Thank you all for coming today. Thanks to those of you who tuned in online. Thank you to everybody who organized this event, to our truth tellers for coming and making such an impact on us, on our brains, on our hearts. And thank you to you all. And to close our time together once again, it's my honor to call upon our elder, Alan Dockstader. Please welcome him to the stage. We're just going to have a water break. That makes a lot of sense.
Before I close, I just want to say thank yous for your speeches and stuff like that, and the encouragements of everybody here. And I want to thank my relationship with Murray Sinclair. It was short-lived, but we had some really good talks, and he was an encouragement to me also. So thank you for everything. Tapkanu we latu anu angquatas dase takwanu we latu kaleta teganu helatasla swagwego anu yungquatnu nagula uska yotu nu kayik mini yot na yungquat nagu lota hage kayik weni slade dane.
Is the feed off now? Is it over? Yes? Okay.